25 years ago was the date that Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh signed a ceasefire ending the conflict there. Since then, while full-scale war has not broken out again, the developments have been, for the most part, negative. Both sides have engaged in an arms race. Public attitudes against the other side have become hardened. An entire generation has grown up not knowing anyone from the other side and being raised only on negative stereotypes in the media, in textbooks, and in political discourse. Sporadic peace talks have failed to achieve much other than the outbreak of another war. More than 600,000 Azerbaijanis remain displaced from their homes in areas now controlled by Armenian forces, and the current population of Karabakh remains under the constant threat that war will break out again, and a new war, if it breaks out, will be far deadlier than the last one. However, in the last few months, there has been new activity that has created more hope around Karabakh than there has been for a long time. Since the coming to power of Nikol Pashinyan last year in Armenia, there's been a new energy to the talks between the two sides. Ceasefire violations have been dramatically down. Last month, I visited a village on the Armenia-Azerbaijan border, used to be subject to regular shootings from the other side. And people there told me that this has been the most peaceful period they remember since 1994. And the two sides have agreed on the need to, quote, prepare the populations for peace, a phrase that has become much discussed around the region and which we will discuss here today. But along with these relatively positive developments are the still underlying fundamental differences between the two sides that have made this conflict so intractable. So the big question we'll be asking here is, what do these positive steps actually mean? How should we think about them? For that we have a small panel, but I like to think that what we lack in quantity we make up for in quality. Sophia is the Caucasus Regional Manager for International Alert. International Alert just published a paper entitled Envisioning Peace, which surveyed public attitudes on all sides of the conflict. Olesia is an analyst for the International Crisis Group. They are working on a new report to be published soon, I understand, on how to move forward in the peace process. So we're going to try to be a little more back and forth in this panel. And to start out, I wanted to ask Sophia about the report that came out. Can you summarize the findings? What did you find about public attitudes around the region? And what, for this audience in particular, what should policymakers take from that? How would listening to these voices on the ground change the approach that we take towards resolving the conflict?
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. So at International Alert, we've been working on in and around the Karabakh conflict, specifically looking at opportunities for grassroots peace building. So our kind of point of view is different to a little bit to what has been said before, because we're interested in particular in what ordinary people on the ground think about the conflict that they themselves have lived through, or that they themselves live with the consequences of. And in a region where it is difficult to do surveys of public opinion, I would say particularly in Azerbaijan and particularly in Nagorno-Karabakh itself, we thought it was very worthwhile to literally go and ask a subsection of people from across the three societies to understand how they view the conflict, and more importantly, how they think they can contribute. And this is meant to inform the policy dialogue which is going on at the higher levels, and is meant to enlarge the space for discussion. This is what we find, I think, most interesting, and is the most interesting developments in the last 12 months, whereby we have a lot of publicity around peace building, conflict resolution, preparing people for peace. And it's a little bit difficult to know what everyone means by these terms. So it's very important to bring the grassroots views to the track one levels. One of the most interesting findings that we had was how people view the conflict in their own personal lives. And it turns out that across the three societies, people view the conflict as part of their own personal identity, which is maybe understandable if you lived through the war, but we find that even the people who didn't live through the war, who've grown up after it, see it as part of their own personal identity, which then can mean that if you do at some point come to a conflict resolution, this means that you will change people's identity. And how receptive people are to that or not is a big question, to which I don't have the answer, but it's an interesting question to discuss. Another point that is important to look at, because when we talk about the Karabakh conflict, we seem to assume, some people assume that every society has homogeneous opinions on the conflict. And this is, at least to outsiders, self-evidently not true. So we found several divides within the societies which need to be looked at in terms of the generational divide is one of the most obvious ones. We have people who lived through the war and we have young people who did not experience the war. To what extent is the older generation willing to hand over to the younger generation responsibility for conflict resolution, and to what extent the younger people want to have that responsibility? That's a big question. There's a great urban and rural divide, which is also to be expected, I think, because you see that in many different countries, but people don't necessarily go and ask the opinions of people who live outside Baku, Yerevan or Stepanakert. And one of the most sensitive divides is also between the host communities and IDP communities. The IDP community obviously is a very sensitive issue, and I think it's really important to understand that in a community like that, not all views are necessarily homogeneous, and I think there's a lot of work to be done on understanding the views within those IDP refugee communities on all sides, on how they view the conflict and how they think they can contribute. So I'm not going to go on through the conclusions of the report, but these are the sorts of things that we talked about with people on the ground, and we have been presenting these conclusions to policymakers. And I would say that over the past 12 months, but even before the Armenian Revolution, there has been a certain opening up of discussion around conflict resolution, conflict management, however you would like to talk about it, in certain civil society circles, which we didn't used to see before. And this, even though it's not necessarily very public, I think this is very important, this opening up of the discussion. So I'll let you continue with that.
I mean, I would be interested to follow up. I mean, if there have been specific things maybe that through your research, through this, for example, recognizing that the conflict is an important part of people's identity, how can one translate that, which seems like a very, to me, true and profound point. How then does a negotiator or a politician translate that into, okay, how are we going to work towards peace given that fact that we don't normally think about with respect to the conflict?
Well, you widened the topic of the discussion. In the end, people talk a lot about peace and compromise, and this is a lot of what we found in the answers to our surveys. You have to dig deeper into the definition of peace, which on one side means stability for understandable reasons, and on the other side means justice for equally understandable reasons. And the word compromise is also understood not necessarily in a different way, but people have a tendency to understand that compromise is something that the other side does, whichever other side it may be. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done into digging into these different definitions and having each side understand the definition that the other side has of this seemingly common term. And that is something that where a lot of work can be done, and through that you can also get into the topic of identity. So conflict is a part of your identity, and then you can talk about what is your identity and the concept of shared identities, which is very limited in this part of the world. Can you be from Armenia? Can you be from the Caucasus? Can you be an IDP? Do you want to be known as an IDP, as a refugee? Do you want that to be your primary identity? So the concept of diverse and shared identities is something that is, which you see in other parts of the world too. Coming from the UK, we have a huge problem with diverse identities. But this is a topic that could be explored a lot more.
Great, thanks. So the conventional wisdom around the conflict has always been that even if the leaders of the two countries were to come to a peace deal, they would have a trouble selling it to the populations. Both Serge Sargsyan and Ilham Aliyev were widely disliked and distrusted among populations. And so were always going to be vulnerable to criticisms that they were selling out or even betraying their country if they came to a peace deal that required difficult concessions, which any peace deal inevitably would. That dynamic in Armenia has now changed with the coming to power of Nikol Pashinyan. He's extremely popular among Armenians, and so if anyone could sell a deal, if anyone has the political capital to sell a deal, it would be him. So far, though, he does not appear to be interested in making unpopular decisions. What do you, Alessia, make of the approach of the new government and what's kind of how the dynamic has changed since last year?
Can you hear me? Yep. Well, I think, yeah, I think it's really very important actually not to discuss Armenia only separately, you know, like taking it separately. And we definitely need to see this thing in the context. And probably as a continuation of what was said before, I would say that actually when we do look into the problems that actually the leaderships face with whatever decisions they are proposed in the peace process, yeah, I understand that actually there are at least three reasons, you know, why it's so difficult to make peace. First, with war-oriented rhetoric, you know, and war-oriented approach has been around for a long time. You know, some say 25 years, some say that there were phases, but actually it has been there and it got reflected in the government, in their bureaucracies. As a person, you know, who was around before the Armenian Revolution and who has been working after that, I can tell you that it's really very interesting to observe actually how difficult it is for sometimes the same officials to make peace, you know, to start thinking in peace terms. It's so much easier for them to respond to the incidents, to some harsh statements from each side, but actually it is so difficult for them to come up with some ideas that can work, you know, and that will not receive lots of protests domestically and can receive some support from abroad. So I would say that actually one of the founding problems that is connected to what Sofia was saying is that the problem with the government themselves does not matter new ones or old ones, they are shaped in a way to wage war, you know, to do it either along the front lines or in the diplomatic process or in media or in other, you know, forums. And the second one, the second reason, and it's kind of comes from that, I would say, that actually whenever I meet officials on either side, either in Baku or in Yerevan, they have so little idea of each other. Sometimes they can speak the same language, foreign language for them, but the words that they use have different meaning on each side. And this is just shocking, you know, because I'm not sure that they themselves realize how different they are and how difficult it is for them to understand. They can speak about exactly the same object and with good intentions, but actually they will still speak in different terms. And with, again, I blame years of with separation and years of confrontation, you know, that they have been living with. And the third reason why it's kind of so difficult to move forward with the peace process, when I also kind of try to understand for myself. And this is what I have been hearing from people in both capitals. It actually, they say, okay, let's imagine that we overcome these difficulties. We find a common language. We agree on terms and agree on every single kind of, you know, detail about what we are to do. But then geopolitics are not welcoming, they're saying. We will still have to invite international mediators or international community to support us. Like the easiest, the most spectacular example is, of course, peacekeeping. Yeah, I mean, who is to do with peacekeeping? And right away, people start saying, "Oh, Russians," but Russians are having a conflict with this and that. So you kind of face a situation when you say, okay, I have problems with my own audience, my own society. I have problems with understanding what the other side wants to do or tries to do. I don't, in many cases, don't have my own plan, you know, what to do, how to proceed, just because I do not have an experience of making peace. And in addition to that, whatever big step, let's say, yeah, I'm to make, that means that I'm to invite the conflict, or a bigger conflict between the West and Russia, to my own context, which is already so problematic. So I would say kind of, you know, if anyone had told me a year ago that they would reach even with progress that we are witnessing now, because I believe that it is amazing what have been happening during the last months, you know, I would probably look at that person and ask, how many beers did you have, you know, just because it's so difficult to imagine that any kind of, you know, steps forward in the current context, both domestically in the region and internationally. And when I say about the progress, I don't know where to discuss this. I mean, first of all, of course, communication channel that was established between the leaders, which hasn't been around for 15 years. One may say that, oh, come on, I mean, what's happening? Actually, it's a major thing, you know. I spoke to military who are along the front line, you know, and of course, their thinking is still about the possible escalation and possible shootings, you know, and how to respond to that. But on the other hand, they also realize that the communication channel and what it brought, it's actually prevention and also a possibility to figure out who is to blame for any kind of incidents, which actually helps, just because less shootings are happening. I know that it sounds very cynical, but less people die. Yeah, it opens things, and again, this hasn't been happening for 15 years. And yeah, there are some other developments, and they are very important. Again, the one that the president of Azerbaijan and Prime Minister of Armenia reached in Vienna in end of March, which is about the visits, which is about with agriculture, support to the farming along the front lines. One may say, oh, come on, with this all small. It's huge. It's huge. So I would say that while we are kind of discussing with politics, it may look not that attractive, but on the other hand, we can see things happening.
Yeah, I would really agree with that, and actually re-emphasize the impact that obviously the Armenian Revolution had on Armenia, but specifically on civil society in Armenia, part of whom also work on peace building. And after years and years of stagnation and of thinking that nothing is ever going to change, these people were involved in a non-violent revolution. So this firstly shows them that the type of work that they do can sometimes be successful. And secondly, it means that quite a few of them end up either in parliament or in government. And this has then also created space within civil society for new young people to come in and to be engaged and to understand the power of civic activism and the power that they have as people in their own societies.
One interesting dynamic I think that's developed since Pashinyan came to power is that there's been a sort of there's a number of, I would say, minor but public disputes between him and between the leadership in Karabakh. And if one reads between the lines, it seems like there's some distrust in Stepanakert of Pashinyan in general, and in particular of the possibility that he might make some kind of concessions. You know, for Alessia, what do you think is going on there politically? Am I reading that correctly? That dynamic?
I think you're kind of pushing me into very troubled waters. But well, I think we really need to look into with relations between Yerevan and Stepanakert, in not kind of only in with from the point of view of like last year, yeah. There were ups and downs during the last 25 years, yeah, and there were the times when actually Stepanakert did not, you know, have nice relationship with the leaderships in Yerevan, but at the same time there were the times when they were really brothers, you know, and in many cases talking to each other on the phone, even about the appointment of assistants and all of that, you know. So I think we are just witnessing this phase here that followed after the revolution, and I would say that it was kind of logical, you know, because during the last decade, the de facto leadership of Nagorno-Karabakh was very closely linked to those who were in the leadership in Armenia, and now those in Yerevan are gone, and the new leader in Yerevan, he does not have a personal attachment to the region just because he's not from there. The previous one, and also and those who were before the one also was from there. So it's I would say that it's a normal process, to be honest. You know, I know that there are a lot of people, you know, kind of speculating about what it means. I can see lots of emotions in Armenia itself, and like, for example, the prime minister, you know, he seems to kind of he's quite emotional in his statements when he sees that the leadership from Stepanakert, that they are actually getting still, you know, inviting for different public events those who were rivals, you know, to Pashinyan. And well, you know, it's really very difficult to be honest, to kind of say that how it is to develop. It is a very local process. A lot will depend on how it goes internally in Karabakh. I heard a lot of people in the leadership in Armenia saying that we do not want to get into this because we kind of believe that they should decide their own destiny. I think there is honesty in this. It's not only kind of political rhetoric. How it develops, I'm a bit pessimist. I have friends who are optimists, you know, so it's rather kind of for us to watch how it will develop, because it very much will depend on individuals, you know, and how people proceed with that, and how the whole thing unfolds. What worries me more in the whole thing is that basically we are let's imagine so that with elections of the new leadership of de facto Nagorno-Karabakh take place next year, as the elections are scheduled for next spring. Yeah, let's imagine that the current leader stays in power. What worries me more is that we are actually to have a new leadership in Stepanakert that will have its say on the peace process. And from this perspective, I think actually this is kind of what I'm more interested in. You know, who are we to get into the process? Who will be that person who will be still discussing things, either in the direct format or indirectly, you know, who will have its say on any kind of steps that they may follow, in the peace process. And with this kind of much more important, to be honest, and the rest is still kind of not in our hands, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with the concept that Yerevan and Stepanakert have not always agreed on everything. This we knew before. And the point now is just that everything has become that more public, and therefore maybe you could say that more transparent. So this just underscores the need to, at least for us as an international NGO, to engage with people who live in Karabakh and not to assume that what they think is exactly the same as what Armenians think, because we know actually more and more over the years that this is not true, and actually opinions may be dividing more and more. So the concept of including everyone in these sorts of programs where they can all meet each other and talk about the conflict and how they might act in it is very important.
So you're, I think, uniquely positioned to answer the question about the populations and their level of preparation for peace, to go back to this phrase that's become ubiquitous. Are they prepared for peace that you found? I mean, what can the governments do to prepare them for peace? And is this even the right way to look at this question, that it's the government's role to prepare the populations for peace?
Well, this is the big question and the big phrase that I hear a lot in Baku, but also in Yerevan, preparation of people for peace, as if it were somehow something new. But maybe it is something new for the governments, and they are possibly not entirely sure how to go about it. What they are doing, and we see this to different degrees on both sides, is that they are opening up the space whereby people, ordinary people, can talk about the peace process. And this is something that is relatively new, and in Armenia and in Azerbaijan. So this is important. And if these new proposals around reciprocal visits of journalists, but also maybe other people from Yerevan to Baku and vice versa, if those ever get off the ground, and they used to happen 10, 15 years ago, then this will increase the transparency and will hopefully also increase the constructive discussions. What worries me a bit, though, is something that your colleague Zaur talked about, is the level of expectations that have been raised, not necessarily on all sides, but there are some people with maybe inflated expectations of what could happen now. This is all part of a process. And then whether peace is realistic or not, you can see further down the line. But it's the getting as many people involved in the process as possible is not something to be sniffed at. As Olesya said, this discussion, public discussion, is something that's quite new and to be encouraged for hopefully for as long as it lasts.
Yeah, I'm one of those who are a bit kind of also asking this question, and I understand that there are different answers to these preparations, preparation people for peace. It kind of sounds a bit patronizing, especially when it is voiced by some foreign politicians, let's say, or diplomats. I would say that actually the best way to show that you have an intention for peace is actually by not just saying this, but actually doing things. And if you ask me, actually, this idea of supporting the farming process along the front lines, it's the best possible thing, they could do to show to the populations, conflict-affected populations, that with this, we are serious about building, bridges, or because this is something that really affects people. And one would say, like, for example, on the Armenia side, along the border, there are about 6,000 people who get affected on this every single year. And with this might be a small number, you know, when you look at the population of Armenia, Azerbaijan, but actually this is very important. And for these people, you know, they have been losing access to their farmlands. And if they are able to finally access the land, you know, and make survival out of this, this is much more important than actually probably, sorry, but like another speech or nice words or things like that. They can also complement the process, but there is a need for real actions. I think there is more space for things like this, but it also requires a certain investment, you know, because I understand that people, for example, in Baku may want to actually see a result not only along the border. Yeah, I mean, one may say, okay, it's great that 6,000 people on the Armenian side and several thousand people on the Azerbaijani side now have access to the farmland that they did not have before. But what's about Nagorno-Karabakh? Yeah, what's about IDPs from the area? What's about actually resolving the issue? And to be honest, I don't have an answer to that. I think it's very political still, you know, and it very much depends on those who will be making decisions, you know, for them also to measure how much their public can get satisfied, yeah, with small steps that they're making.
I would agree with that, and when you talk about it being political, what we need in the peace-building community is for everything to be depoliticized. So when we come to these ideas, I know, but this is what we need. When we talk about reciprocal visits, or you talk about families visiting detainees on the other side, there's modalities in place for this to happen. ICRC, International Red Cross, can make this happen if it's done in a depoliticized way. When the sides want to do something in a depoliticized way, it can happen, and it can happen very fast, and I have personal experience of that. The minute that these kinds of things are politicized, then it becomes impossible for us to do anything.
Great. So looking at the questions we got, I'd first like to deal with this sort of meta question about the panel, about the representation on the panel. This is something that I discussed with Andre before the panel, and agreed that Andre would explain the thinking of the organizers for the selection of the panel.
Thank you. My name is Andre. I'm one of the organizers for Stratpol. So we thought about this panel, and every year we try to have a representative from Armenia, representative from Azerbaijan, and then we discussed that we don't really know what does that mean, that there is no average Armenian, average Azeri, unless we invite somebody from the government. So we decided that we want to change this a little bit. Also, we don't know what does it mean, so we decided to invite none of them and offer an outside perspective from the speakers that we have now. So now we have none of the representative. We feel that the panel is balanced like this, so this is our answer.
Thank you, Andre. I'll myself say, you know, I was at this conference 2 years ago, and I was on a panel on a different subject, some regional security thing, and I asked a friend, I said, what do you think who was also on the panel, what do you think they want me to talk about? And he said, okay, look at the people on the panel. There's an Azerbaijani, there's a Georgian, there's an Armenian, there's a Turk, and you're the American. So you have to talk as the American. And I'm like, well, I don't focus on American foreign policy. I don't really like, being thought of as the representative for the United States. So while I appreciate the organizers' dilemma here that you want to have local voices, but at the same time, who can speak for everyone? So thank you, Andre. On to the rest of the questions. Okay, here's a provocative one that got 10 votes. The change of leadership in Yerevan has led to renewed seriousness in peace talks from the Armenian side. Is progress possible without government change in Baku? I'll start with that. I think that there is a misperception in Armenia that the thing that holding back real progress from the Azerbaijani side is the Aliyev government, and that if some democratic government came to power, then somehow the feelings of the Azerbaijani people would change, or that their desire for justice for what happened to them would somehow disappear. I think that's a misperception and misunderstands what the popular opinion is in Azerbaijan. Maybe Sophia could speak to this more.
I would agree with that. I think what needs to change, and this I would say across the region, is that you need to break out of what is sometimes known as the peace-building bubble, whereby we have some of the same people who come to the same meetings and meet the same people on the other side for years. You need to bring in new people who wouldn't necessarily regard themselves as peace builders, whatever that means, but who have an interest, again, in being civically active and in meeting people from the other side. So you need to create the conditions for that to happen. And I don't know necessarily that a change of regime in Azerbaijan would necessarily help that along particularly.
There's an interesting process question about the Minsk group. Is the instrument obsolete, needing refreshment? I might add to that, expand that question. There's been some debate about the Madrid principles, and this has been the sort of operating framework that the talks have been conducted in for several years. I mean, in general, do we need some kind of dramatic new approach, or would that just destroy something without the possibility of building something new? What do you think, Alessia?
Well, this is what people say, you know, when they kind of cite the need, when they try to ignore all the questions about the reform of Minsk Group and so on. Well, when I speak to people who are directly involved in the process, I understand that this is something that actually unites them. I mean, they all are not happy about the Minsk Group, yeah? I mean, but on the other hand, they are too afraid that if they remove the format, that there will be nothing else, and there will be all the agreements or all the statements that were made in 25 years, they will be kind of questioned, and so all of this comes in. Well, you know, it's with Minsk Group thing has been around for so long, you know, with people criticizing it. It's mainly just because, you know, it consists of 3 countries, and from time to time one of them is more interested in the process, and now seems like everyone is more or less kind of, you know, diverted their attention to some other parts, you know, of the world. But I would disagree with you about Madrid principles. I don't think that it is directly linked to the Minsk Group. I think it's a major... Yeah. So what are the Madrid principles? Madrid principles are about three principles that were adopted in 2007. And with principles, I spoke to one American diplomat who was at the table, you know, when this thing was agreed, and that diplomat could not understand why they're adopting them all together, because they are actually coming from the Helsinki document, you know. So they are very general, and they actually bring something that is there. Based on these 3 principles, and these 3 principles are actually about territorial integrity, right for self-determination, and no war or threat of war. Based on this, then they developed 6 elements. And these 6 elements are there, you know, and the reading of these 6 elements very much varies on who you are talking to and in which period. You know, so you, for example, look at the interviews of the people who were involved in the process, let's say 8 years ago, and you can see that some of the elements they were in favor. Now you speak to the same person, and that person say that I'm completely against. if we heard from both sides after the Armenian Revolution that they still are ready to go and to make use of the Madrid principles, which are free. And 6 elements, yeah, there. If you ask me, I can see how to make this thing work. The problem for me with this kind of package of Madrid principles and elements is that people are mainly looking for the final result, return of lands. But how this should be happening? What is the process? Let's imagine that I'm the one who is now living in Nagorno-Karabakh, and I'm hearing that a portion of the territory, let's say I live in Hadrut, which is right next to the Jabril district, which is supposed to go back, yeah, according to the elements. And that exposes my town right away. And if I'm afraid of the other side, that most probably I will ignore and I will never ever agree with that. If someone comes and discusses and agrees to discuss how we should be happening, yeah, the process, what kind of guarantees we are to have, how I'm going to participate in the process, I mean, in general, yeah, how the person who is to come and live next to me is going, how we are to actually coexist. Does not matter what will be the fate of these territories. This has never happened. No one made this exercise. So we are actually talking about 3 principles and 6 elements that were never unfolded, that never saw any kind of detailed conversation and debate. And not only in the public, but actually internally as well. So when I speak to the former officials, they cannot explain how this referendum is going to happen. They all have their own understanding. This is wrong. You know, and that undermines the process, and that also leads to more frustration on both sides, and with more people saying that peace is not possible and war is the only solution. So to the point, and I kind of act now as an activist, I understand the problems with the Minsk group, with the Madrid principles and all of this. But I still think that instead of just like looking for some major things and going for huge demands, blunt demands, you should start working and be honest about your possibilities, what you have, what realities have developed on the ground, and what can be done in short term, in longer term. And this could be the only way out, to be honest. Yeah.
We have several questions about the international context, of course. What's the role of Russia? Would it support a resolution? In what terms? Do you not think that the main reason of disagreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan is Russian provocations? Are the powers benefiting from evaluating the tensions between Armenia? I think all these questions are getting at the same thing, which is, you know, to what Russia, and I think we can expand it to other international players as well. To what extent is this a conflict between the people of this region, and how much of it is being driven from outside?
Well, what I would say personally is that the role of Russia in all the unresolved conflicts in its neighborhood is quite often characterized in the same way, and I think that's a mistake. These conflicts are all different in their own way, and they have their own characteristics. And I would say the Karabakh conflict in particular is a bit of an outlier. I wouldn't say that Russia has the same role that it does, for example, in Abkhazia and Ossetia. So I think we need to get away from that stereotype in the beginning. One interesting thing that we found, again, coming back to our survey, we asked people who they think is responsible for resolving the conflict. And they effectively delegated this responsibility to the authorities, to the Minsk group, to Russia, basically to anyone else except them. But in the same breath, they effectively said that they don't trust Russia to resolve the conflict. So you see again this sort of contradiction in people's minds. So I can see, in a sense, why it's appealing to blame an outsider, but I don't see that it helps very much. I mean, the answer is to be found in cross-border dialogue, but also and especially in internal dialogue within the societies where they decide themselves what they mean and what sort of process they're looking for.
Well, I think it's a very interesting dynamic that has been unfolding during the last year. We've actually we have been seeing Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders meeting without mediators, and Russia is one of them, right? And I think it's kind of a very interesting thing, you know, to watch for us. And again, I mean, I said this earlier that. It's better to keep your own trouble and your own problem out of someone else. And with bilateral attempts, does not matter how successful they are, they actually, I think they indicate this very thing, you know, that they would prefer to do things together without kind of interference from someone else, because first it's a trouble just because you're kind of bringing in geopolitical context. Second, not all of them trust Russia because there are kind of, you know, some memories or people look at Georgia or Ukraine or some other places, and they are kind of, they do not really want same scenarios in a sense, yeah. But on the other hand, look, there are things like peacekeeping, yeah. And the only country that has been willing to contribute is Russia, yeah. I mean, I'm talking about Lavrov plan since 2015, and who else is there to contribute? We haven't been seeing many people, you know, like talking about this altogether. So while everyone kind of, you know, pointing at Russia, yeah, seems like these guys, you know, they're kind of home alone for quite a long time. And they reach the point when they say that, okay, let's talk together, and if at some point we need some help, then we will invite someone from outside. I see the question there about South Ossetia and Abkhazia, comparing Karabakh, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And as a person who has been working on Georgian conflicts for much longer than Nagorno-Karabakh, I can tell you that these are very different contexts. And it is a major misconception, and I think it's a major problem that we have been having, and not only here in the region, but actually in other parts as well, kind of uniting Donbass and you know, all of this all together. These are parts of different things, and there is, I mean, just very kind of small, whatever, you know, like, I don't know the level, right? I mean, of knowledge here, but in Nagorno-Karabakh there have been never peacekeepers. So Nagorno-Karabakh never had Russian peacekeepers, let's say, or Russian presence on the ground. So it's very different. Nagorno-Karabakh does not, people living in Nagorno-Karabakh do not have Russian passports. They do not receive Russian, any kind of support or subsidies. You do not see presence of Russia in Nagorno-Karabakh. And if you do not know this kind of small elements there, then it's kind of speculation, you know, that is around, that South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, Transnistria, Donbass, they are all the same. It's just wrong. It's a mistake.
Yeah, and there are a couple of points that I wanted to add. It's interesting what you say about Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders meeting without mediators now, because in some ways we might start to find that a little bit reflected amongst civil society as well. For the past 20, 25 years, I think people have got used to cross-border meetings, always mediated by an external NGO. Now, some people are starting to question this format and start to say, well, why can't Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Karabakhis organize their own meetings? And we start to see in some places some projects being organized without international mediation, which I'm perfectly in favor of. This then, they come with their own sensitivities and maybe come with a bit their own problems, but you see a little bit the same concept reflected at different levels of society. My other point, when we talk about external actors, shall we say, I mean, we haven't mentioned the diasporas. We haven't really worked much with them because we're not quite sure how helpful they could be. But maybe that's another point to think about. I mean, the diasporas that are in Moscow are maybe one thing, the diasporas in Europe and America are another.
Yes, I think there was a question on the list here about the diaspora, I think sort of tendentiously worded, but the idea was that, you know, are the diasporas, or the diaspora, I think it was about the Armenian diaspora, creating problems. And, you know, tendentiousness aside, maybe it's worth discussing the role. I mean, I know that some of the big American diaspora groups have been kind of lobbying actively against the peace talks in the format that they're in.
Well, I think we see both diasporas are actually quite active now. I think in the past we've not worked with them too much because what they say publicly is maybe not massively helpful to the kind of peace building work that is needed on the ground. However, this can change over time. To a certain extent, you might be able to see that in the Armenia-Turkey relations. But I think there's work to be done on that, possibly more because the diasporas in Moscow, I think, have a slightly different outlook to necessarily other diasporas. But they're also a potential factor of influence, of course.
Probably just add one thing to that. I would not try to portray diasporas as a reason, of the problems or the tool to resolve. This is rather the consequence. So just one example. So Nagorno-Karabakh conflict zone does not receive any kind of international support. Yeah. The only one is the U.S. government that supports Hello Trust, but the rest is not happening. So how to, let's say, build hospitals, schools, or roads, or anything, any kind of assistance, where it should come from while you are not able to receive any kind of funding and support other types of support. And yeah, it's kind of, obvious that people in Nagorno-Karabakh will be happy to have diaspora, which is volunteering and helping them to live, and to rebuild and continue life. Yeah, and I understand the problem that that people attach to that. That okay, then it's reinforcing with Armenian discourse, and some nationalistic moods and all of that. And then I'm asking, yeah, but what's an alternative to that? Yeah, so this is again, for me, it's more the consequence rather than the reason or even the tool to the conflict.
And then, of course, there are different kinds of diasporas, and though actually one of the ones that we're working with the most is possibly the youngest diasporas, whereby you see people from this region going to study abroad in Europe, in the States, and then staying there. And this is also a kind of diaspora, and we are increasingly using these young people who grew up partly in the region, but also have an international outlook. And this is a resource that we're drawing on as well.
There's a good question about the what tangible steps have been taken in each country, Armenia and Azerbaijan, to prepare the populations for peace. We at Eurasianet did a story about this a couple of months ago, and some of the things I remember are, they're very small steps, but the Armenian public TV aired a report from a border village talking about how the people there used to be friends with their Azerbaijani neighbors. That was something that had not happened before. Somebody looked at Ilham Aliyev in the the Sumgait anniversary, or it was one of these anniversaries. They looked at his statements and found a big difference between this year and last year. And big, maybe overstating it, but a significant difference in the sort of level. You know, he will often use quite aggressive language. This year it was, you know, noticeably milder.
Well, obviously, the most tangible step, though obviously tangible is not all that visible, but is self-evidently is going to be human capital. The people who are engaged in cross-border projects are people who have met the other side, they've met them repeatedly, they've worked with them in different projects, in media projects, youth projects, things like that. These are people who the governments are going to need in 10 years' time or in 20 years' time, whenever it comes to it. So this is the answer that I always give when I get this specific question from the governments. In the end, it's preparing the constituencies that they're going to need to have these people work with them during the process that is peace building.
Yeah, there was another interesting example. There's an independent Azerbaijani news agency, Turan, and their editor went to Yerevan and did a series of reports which were really fascinating. And he had, fairly frank and often contentious arguments with Armenians, but they were honest and interesting. And he published all of these in a long series of reports, and that was also seen as part of this this process. I don't know if there's going to be something similar going the other way.
There have been visits the other way. I mean, less public ones that I know of as well.
Well, I would add probably to the report about this. You mentioned public broadcaster, just one report many months ago. I think as the one who has been following the Armenian media, I think the statement that was made by the Armenian Prime Minister in March during the press conference, when he basically said that why are we always fighting with each other in the social media? Yeah, one may say, yeah, it's funny, but actually, this is the first time you're having an Armenian leader who is saying that it's fine not to fight. And I actually, his statements, sometimes when I listen to what he says and how he formulates things, if you compare it to the previous leaders and other officials in Armenia, they are revolutionary. Because and what he does is actually he is promoting a very new discourse in Armenia, which is not only about we had the war and there is an enemy and we live with the threat of war. This is all there. It's not going anywhere. Yeah, but what he does is that he is promoting the idea that actually these are not only us human, yeah, the other side, on the other side we also see human. And he's constantly saying this, that I'm ready to speak to these people. Well, one would say that maybe it may sound naive, to someone, but actually this is a huge thing, yeah, for the Armenian society and for Armenian language society. And I would only compliment that, I think one would need the courage to actually make statements like this, and yeah.
As we move towards our conclusion, I wonder if you could, both of you, I'd be interested to think of your take, taking a step back. Like what can realistically be expected now in this process? What's an optimistic but plausible scenario that you see coming out of this conflict in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years, both of you?
Okay, if we're thinking very short term, and you want to be realistic and optimistic at the same time, I think that's an interesting combination. What I would be most interested in seeing is reciprocal visits. This has been talked about now in abstract terms, and there have been some visits to both sides. Some are more public than others, but they're still very limited, and it's just a few people here and there. I would like to see more of that, particularly if they're going to be journalists visiting each side, because then the potential for wider dissemination of people's impressions is obviously much bigger. Because one thing that we find very limiting is the constant need to bring people out into a third country, whether it's to Tbilisi or to another country. This is time-consuming and expensive, but it also gets people into a mentality whereby if you want to do peace building, then you get to travel, which is lovely, but it's not actually the aim. So I would wish to see, or maybe public or not so public, more visits from all sides to the other side, including then, you know, if we could have Azerbaijanis to Karabakh, etc. It's complicated, and the modalities, working out the modalities is hugely complicated, I know, but that's what I would wish for.
Yeah. Well, first thing is that definitely there is a need to sustain the current calm along the front lines. And with this is a major achievement, but with this a lot of work to continue doing this, you know, not shooting at each other. And when there is an incident, to actually face the problem in good faith and to find the ways how to proceed at that. Agricultural season has started, so we would probably observe how it goes, but without ceasefire along the front lines, it will be very difficult to actually proceed with this farming program. The second thing that I would definitely want to see, I mean, the first one is calm along the front lines. The second thing is definitely about substantial negotiations. It's very important to start the process and to engage in a good faith without actually being afraid that you are undermining yourself by discussing the things that are might be unpopular in your society. I understand that it is very difficult for anyone in Baku to discuss the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, but discussing status does not mean that you are recognizing Nagorno-Karabakh right away. I understand that it is very difficult on the Armenian side to discuss return of territories, but discussing this very issue does not mean that you are actually, you know, I don't know, packing them with territories at ribbon, you're kind of welcoming enemy. So actually ignorance of these very issues is going to lead to even deeper deadlock and lots of frustration on both sides. Yeah, and look, I mean, while we are talking here, both leaders are in Brussels, and yeah, there is no formal meeting scheduled, but who knows, maybe they are WhatsApping each other, you know, and they will be kind of meeting somewhere there. They have been very good at actually having informal meetings so far. So yeah, hopefully this possible meeting or any upcoming communication between the sides is to help with these two things. One is a ceasefire, and the second, substantial talks.
All right, that seems a suitable note on which to end. So thanks everyone for the good questions, and thanks to Olesya and Sophia.
We have some coffee outside, 15 minutes break.